Good morning, boys and girls. It's Monday morning, so we're going to go over our next doctor of the church. So I am going to share my screen with you once again, and I'm going to tell you about a very important doctor of the church. Some people think he might be the most important, and this, of course, would be Saint Thomas Aquinas. Now, Saint Thomas Aquinas is the perfect saint for us to consider as kind of someone who gives us a horizon about how we should view the saints, the doctors of the church in general. And I'll tell you why. I taught you this in August, but obviously that was a long time ago. We discussed how in the year 1294, the first four doctors of the church were proclaimed. And we had issues of proclamations in our past. So, for example, I told you in the 4th century, Saint Augustine spoke of Saints Irenaeus, Saints Ambrose, and Jerome as, quote, we're going to use our Latin here, Sanctos Doctores, holy doctors. Now, this is a good teaching moment. When Augustine mentioned Irenaeus, one of my favorite fathers of the church, we'll remind ourselves he is not a doctor of the church because he was martyred. So in the tradition of the church, if you were martyred, that honor is so high above anything else. We don't have martyrs listed as doctors of the church. So just a little side note there. Then jumping to the 6th century, Pope St. Gregory the Great, he declared that the apostles were, quote, doctores sanctae, sorry for my sloppy writing there, ecclesiae, sanctae ecclesiae, holy doctors of the church. He talked about the apostles in that way. So we have different things in our past pointing out doctors. When we want to get to something actually official, okay, we're talking about official teaching, we are going to look at the year 1568. And that is when Pope Pius V, who is actually a Dominican, he declares St. Thomas Aquinas a doctor of the church. So my point is, once we hit the 16th century, the church is going to be more official about who are actually doctors, and it begins with St. Thomas Aquinas. So this review is perfect to refer back to Aquinas. Just a quick reminder, our last doctor of the church was, I believe, in 2015, Pope Francis named a doctor of the church, okay? So let's now look at Aquinas, at our doctor, and let me tell you a little bit about him. Hopefully this is a review for you. Aquinas is called the Angelic Doctor. Isn't that wonderful? He's the Angelic Doctor. A few weeks ago, I told you about Bonaventure because these two share a century. Remember, Bonaventure is a Franciscan, Aquinas is a Dominican, and they share this exciting century. So what century are we talking about? We're talking about the Middle Ages. And when we look at Aquinas and the Middle Ages, we're looking from the end of antiquity to the end of the Renaissance. Basically, we're looking at the 7th until the 14th century. It's kind of, what we would look at for the Middle Ages. Now, let's zero in on the 13th century. This is a very important century. We're in the 1200s. This is what some scholars call the flowering of the Middle Ages, and we're going to see certain beautiful things flower, and then we're going to see certain things enter into sharp decline. So it's an instructive century for us. Think about the Middle Ages. It's the year of Christendom. That's what our older kids call it. This is when the church penetrates all aspects of culture. Think of those beautiful cathedrals, because the church had these structures of thinking that enfolded all areas of life. So indeed, the 1200s, we have the beginnings of the important universities. We have Paris, Oxford, Naples in Italy, Salamanca in Spain. We have the flowering of these universities. You've probably studied the Fourth Lateran Council. It's the age of the Crusades. There's a lot going on. Well, as you've studied in class before, we have the rise of new religious orders. This is going to be important for studying St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, let's go back to our history. Remember, prior to the 13th century, let's go all the way back to Rome. Think about someone like St. Benedict. We had monastic orders. Remember, monks began in the East. We're going back to Egypt, right? And they could sleep outside. It was pretty warm. Once we get to St. Benedict in the 6th century, it's colder in Italy, we have a more organized form of monks taking shape, the Benedictines, who borrowed a lot from St. Basil's order in the East, okay? So we had monks in the West. And just to review our history, a lot of people, when Christianity became legal in the late 4th century, and there were no more persecutions and martyrdoms, people said, how am I going to be a saint? So they ran off to the monasteries to be enclosed, to be isolated, to pray for the world. And this served the church greatly. This was how, and this is important for our classical curriculum, this is how learning was preserved, how education was preserved. And this worked very well for us. What's great about studying church history, we always see how this Holy Spirit enters new men and new women to show us what we need. Once we're in the 13th century, I'll share my screen again, we see the psychology of the monastic orders changing. We have the rise of mendicant orders. These are orders that beg for food, for sustenance, and they go out to the people. What happened was so many people were in the monasteries, the quality of education declined. People needed better training in their faith. And so we have someone like Saint Dominic de Guzman, a Spaniard. He starts the Dominicans, right? The Dominican order. Of course, we've talked in previous lessons about same time, Saint Francis of Assisi, right? He starts the Franciscans. So during this time, we would say we have two schools of theology. And we talked about this when we looked at Bonaventure. We've got the Franciscans, we've got the Dominicans. If you study your church history, you will see we need both. The Dominicans tended to emphasize learning more. These are the men behind the Holy Inquisition and some of their writings. They're working against heresy. The Franciscans have a different charism, although they were by no means opposed to intellectual development, as Saint Bonaventure attests. But let's go back to our friend Saint Thomas Aquinas. He becomes a Dominican. Now, his story is so interesting. Remember, I mentioned to you the Benedictines, or the Benedict monks. These monks, going back to the 5th century, had become very prominent in the church. And if you came from a well-off family, you wanted to go to Monte Cassino. That is where the prominent place was for men who wanted to be important monks. And so Aquinas came from a prominent family, Aquino, and his family wanted him to do this traditional, respected line of work in the church. But Aquinas did not feel called to do that. He wanted to be a Dominican, okay? And I think this is a great lesson for all of us, because a lot of times God will call us to something that our closest family members or friends will not understand. So Aquinas's brothers were so upset at him, they literally kidnapped him and they locked him up. And I believe it was for a year. They locked him up for a year, and there's all kinds of dramatic things that happened. But finally, they realized he wasn't going to give in, and they tested him severely. And he finally was released. He became a priest. He became a professor, and he was so brilliant, the popes, they said, you know, we need you. So he actually followed the papal court around, and he helped them tremendously in their various intellectual battles. He did help with intellectual battles, but he was extremely humble. But he was extremely brilliant. He could talk to different scribes at once, and they would write down what he was saying. They say sometimes he'd be in the middle of dinner, and he would just bang on the table and say, well, that's the answer to such and such a problem. Now, he wrote, of course, many famous works. I'm just going to write a few for you that you've probably heard. The Summa Contra Gentiles. That's a very important one. Of course, his most well-known is the Summa Theologiae. The Summa Theologiae. And boy, isn't this important? This is such a huge, overwhelming work. I'd encourage you, they do make a Summa of the Summa, if you want to just start with a little bit. But this book, I'm going to read you what some experts say, because they know better than I do. This is, quote, the fullest exposition of theologic teaching ever given to the world. That's quite a compliment. During the Council of Trent, this is after the Protestant Reformation, the fathers of the council had scripture and Aquinas' Summa Theologia to work with them. Also, what was I just reading that I wanted to share with you? In the history of the church, there is only one example of an ecumenical council calling for the faithful to read the books of a saint. And it's actually Vatican Council II in the 60s. They recommended that Catholics read Aquinas. So that's a big deal, and something that we may not talk about enough. Now, what's so great about Aquinas, we could talk for hours, but very important is how he took the work of the great philosopher Aristotle. We know from our studies at school, Aristotle was a pagan Greek philosopher, brilliant. Aquinas took Aristotle in the same way Augustine had used Plato. So Augustine is back in the 4th century. Augustine had baptized Plato, and that guides the church for 1,000 years, okay? So that happened, that passed. We still use that. That's our foundation. But Aquinas read Aristotle, and he baptized him for the church, and it was extremely controversial. The Inquisition even examined Aquinas and said, hey, what's going on here? A lot of people accused him of heresy. It was extremely controversial. But of course, Aquinas was vindicated later on. What Aquinas did was, let me look at you to tell you what he did, because it's so important. Aquinas integrated Aristotle's principles with traditional theology. Think about it. It's so important. He took Aristotle's principles, he integrated it with theology, and he gave us this sort of holy and new Christian philosophy. I'll put philosophy in quotation marks because the church doesn't want to claim one philosophy for her own. But Aquinas did give us many of the concepts that we use. He actually remolded and rethought existing materials and old problems, and then gave us this new way of thinking about the sacraments, of thinking about salvation, and many things that would help us today. One scholar says Aquinas gave us a sense of proportion. Think of those cathedrals, that proportion, how grand and big it is. He gave us a sense of proportion with very simple principles, but something grand and amazing and magnificent. And I think sharing with you another little nickname that he has will make the point even better. I told you he's called the Angelic Doctor. His other name is also in Latin, Doctor Communis. Now, it's not communism, Doctor Communis, meaning common doctor. What do we mean by common? It means he has tremendous scope, tremendous universality. In fact, I want to tell you, and I found this to be true, if you want to know the truth about almost anything, you can find it in Aquinas. It's just amazing. And so that's why he's called Doctor Communis. So, I mean, he's just amazing. We could talk about him for hours. We don't have time. But of course, don't forget, he wrote devotionals, prayers, hymns, particularly Eucharistic hymns that we use in the liturgy. His prayer life was amazing. He was a man who prayed with tears. And I want to read you a quote from him, because I want to end with the point that although Aquinas was brilliant and read and studied, everyone who knew him said his great brilliance came from his prayer life, not just from his intellect. And this is what Aquinas said: I learned more in kneeling at the foot of a crucifix than in writing and studying. And so he is a great example for all of us. So we call on the Angelic Doctor, ora pro nobis. I hope that I have inspired you to think more about Aquinas and to look into him and see how he appeals into your own life. Until next time, God bless you.